Well, good morning, everyone. And thanks for your continued attention as you grab a bite to eat and as they set up. Let me just announce the speakers in this panel. We will have 3 talks, and one is going to be 2 are case studies. One case study in Turkey, another one situated in Algeria, and then a third more theoretical sort of framework, and we'll go in this order. Would that be okay? Yeah? So you will go second?
Oh, okay.
Yeah? Okay. So our first speaker is Elise Massicard. She's from the CNRS, the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. And she's going to be speaking on the topic, When Heterodoxy Challenges the Public Place of Religion, the Case of Alevism in Turkey. So, take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank to the organizers for inviting me to the conference. I will speak about Turkey, and you may all know that Turkey is widely considered the first Muslim laïc or secular state. But still, in the last years, the relationship between state and religion has been widely challenged there. And interestingly, it has been challenged from different directions, from the party in power, the Justice and Development Party, which has an Islamist background, as you know, and also by other movements. And today I will speak about the challenges brought by a movement demanding the recognition of heterodoxy, Alevinism. So Alevis, let me briefly tell you that they are estimated to, well, let's say 12 to 15 million in Turkey, and they enjoy no status and have been demanding recognition in the last decades. So first, I will argue that the claims of Alevis are not only about the status of Alevinism, but also challenge institutional arrangements between state and religion in Turkey, and especially question the issue of religious pluralism and neutrality of the state. Secondly, I will argue that this challenge actually has failed on the whole to change these basic arrangements. And my third point will deal with the Alevists resorting to alternative ways to get satisfaction, these ways being judicialization of their claims and extraversion, especially towards the European Union. So let me first briefly tell you who Alevis are. Well, Alevinism is both considered as heterodox and syncretistic. It is characterized by diverse influences, especially from Shia Islam. So, for example, the cult of Ali, or the 12 Imams, or the fast of Muharrem. And also influences from Islamic mysticism, because it has strong esoteric features. And however, what is interesting here is that the requirements of Islam actually bear little on Alevi life. For example, Alevis do not fast during Ramadan, and they do not perform the Islamic prayer. Instead, they have specific rituals. So on the slide you can see an Alevi ceremony, which is called Jam, and which, as you see, does not really look like what's going on in the mosque. So that's... And Alevis also have specific institutions, specific cultural practices, etc., which are hardly linked to Islam. So there is an ongoing debate among Alevis about them being part of Islam or not. Actually, this is not very clear. So let me just put it aside for today. Anyway, Alevis were stigmatized as heretics under the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century. It means since the Ottoman Empire became a defender of Sunni Islam. And what's interesting here is that during the Turkish Republic alike, Alevis were given no official recognition, contrary to some non-Muslim groups who gained the status of minority under international pressure. And one reason for this denial lies in the fact that Islam was accepted as a kind of national identity marker of Turkishness. And in fact, the crucial place of religion in the nation-building process means that speaking about a separation of state and religion in the Republic of Turkey is misleading. And I think that many people speak about this separation, especially in France, because they are misled by the official principle of laïcité, laiklik in Turkish, which is in the Turkish constitution since the late 30s. But actually, this word has a different meaning in Turkey, and I would argue that one should speak for Turkey about the domestication of religion by the state, because the state controls religion, and this fact is embodied mainly through the Directory of Religious Affairs, called also Diyanet. This state institution is in charge of religion and manages both mosques and clergymen, whom it nominates and pays. And moreover, until recently, the Diyanet was writing the Friday preachers read in every mosque all over the country, therefore promoting a kind of official state religion. So the consequence of that is that the Turkish state is heavily involved in religious affairs. And the next question is, what is this official religion? What does it look like? It is a kind of modernist version of the Sunni Hanefi interpretation. Therefore, the Turkish state is far from being religiously neutral. On the contrary, it has endorsed and institutionalized one interpretation of Islam as a kind of official denomination, denying or leaving aside all other interpretations. So if we come back to the typology of Silvio Ferrari yesterday, we have in Turkey a kind of dominant religion, but it is unspoken as such. So, and what is the role, the place of Alevis in this framework? Well, actually, according to this difference blindness, the institutions consider Alevis as Muslims, but Muslims who have somehow been pushed aside from the true path. So institutions see Alevis as a subgroup of Islam, whose specificity is very minor and is mainly cultural. So basically, no different treatment is reserved to them, and Alevi children, for example, must attend compulsory religious courses at school, where only the official religion is taught. So since the 80s, an Alevist movement developed, which has voiced demands to get public recognition of Aleviness as a legitimate element of Turkish society and to obtain equal participation in all spheres of life without facing discrimination. However, these claims do challenge the official understanding of the relationship between state and religion, since they imply the recognition of religious pluralism and question the neutrality of the state. So I will briefly mention three main claims. Firstly, one of the main claims is the recognition of Alevi worship places as worship places. So they are called cemevis. Actually, in Turkey, mosques, churches and synagogues enjoy the status of worship places and benefit from some privileges like free electricity, water, and the allocation of building sites. But Alevi, cemevi do not, and therefore they have the status of associations, and it is much more difficult to build them because you have less money. So many buildings are stopped in midstream like this one. The second important claim is about compulsory religious instruction. Because this is compulsory, but this teaching is not about different religions and cultures, but instead it is teaching Sunni beliefs and practices alone, like it's clear from the book. Actually, this practice of prayer does not really concern Alevis. So Alevis blame that for being biased and assimilatory. However, they diverge about the solution to propose, while most Alevis are against the very existence of religion classes in the secular state and think this course should be made optional or even abolished. Others argue that its content should be changed to more religious neutrality, for instance, by including some teachings on Alevinism and possibly other religions as well. So the third main claim concerns the Diyanet itself. All Alevis blame the Diyanet for representing alone the Sunni interpretation of Islam, but in the same way, they also diverge because some of them defend its suppression and others demand that Aleviness be integrated or represented into the Diyanet. Well, to put it bluntly, Alevis claim equal treatment and the neutrality of the institution, either through a really secular-like state exerting no control on religion, no Diyanet, and no religious course, or by keeping this relationship between state and religion, but by introducing equal treatment and thus pluralism. So this brings me to my second point, because after more than 20 years of mobilization, the movement has achieved very little, and there has been some minor claims which were accepted. State institutions no longer deny the very existence of Alevis, but on the whole, nothing has been changing on the very basic relationship between state and religion on these institutional arrangements. For example, there has been no recognition of any official status, not the abolition of Diyanet or the compulsory religion classes. And for example, in 2006, there was a parliamentary debate on the content of the term worship place. What does it really mean? And again, in this debate, the exclusion of Gemevi from this category was reasserted. The only important change that took place occurred in 2005 when some teachings on Aleviness were introduced into the religious education syllabus. However, this change was again very controversial since the way Aleviness is presented is widely considered as a further attempt for assimilation, because basically the syllabus stresses the similarities between Alevis and Sunnis, so it doesn't mention the basic differences. So it means that actually the authorities keep trying to encompass and subordinate Aleviness to mainstream Islam, so that the understanding of one official state-controlled and unitary religion, excluding other options, did not really change. And this becomes very obvious because in 2007, the party in power, the Justice and Development Party, launched a policy called Alevi Opening. And so this was a very big event and mediatic and so on. And with many symbolic gestures like ministers recognizing the oppressions that Alevis had been suffered and so on, and high-ranking politicians and statesmen making symbolic and discursive gestures, and promises by the Prime Minister Erdogan to accommodate Alevi requests. However, very few concrete steps were taken. For example, about the Gemevis as worship places, this was again not really accepted. And furthermore, the government provides to revise the content of the compulsory religion classes, but hasn't done it yet, so it remains to be seen. So it is very significant, for example, that one of the very strong symbolic gestures made by the government was the organization of an iftar, the breaking the fast during Ramadan, but this time not during Ramadan, but during Muharram, which is the fast taken by Alevis. So they organized that, you see them here, on the model of Sunni iftar during Ramadan, which is a very important and symbolic time, and eating together after fasting and so on. But it is very significant because the Alevi fast is quite different, because actually people do eat during the day. They don't eat meat and they don't eat very fat things, but still they eat. So there is no sense in making a big meal when breaking the fast. So it's a kind of nonsense. For Alevis criticized it very much telling that, government officials considered again that Alevis should follow the mainstream dominant model. So this brings me to my third point. Because of the failure to gain recognition of these claims through the political fields, Alevis have turned towards two directions, which are extroversion and judicialization. First, Alevi migrants in Europe also claim those rights abroad, especially in Germany. And that's the point I developed in Florence last December, so I won't go into details here. But the important point is that in 2000, a Berlin administrative court granted them the status of a religious community and the right to teach Aleviness in public schools. So it was much more successful abroad. And in the same way, since the early 2000s, Alevis have resorted to European institutions in order to use Turkey's European accession process as a lever for change in Turkey. And the European Commission has actually legitimized Alevis' demand in all its annual reports. And in the reports of the Commission, you see that the Commission implicitly recognizes Aleviness as a religious phenomenon within Islam. So even if this has hardly had any concrete consequences on the concrete situation of Alevis in Turkey, with tiny exceptions, it has been an important step for Alevis. And the second process here is that Alevis have channeled the conflict over the place of religion in the public sphere into the judicial arena. They have done so in Turkey and abroad. But in Turkey, they have many struggled actually in the legal judicial realm, not positively for recognition because they could find no legal opportunity to do this, but negatively. It means against calumny, against discriminations, which are claims who match in the legitimate framework of national unity and equality. So actually some courts took decisions condemning calumny and discrimination experienced by Alevis, but most of the time, especially on, again, the basic arrangements between, about the place, relationships between state and religion, again, Alevis faced the blindness of the authorities, and now they are beginning to resort to the European Court of Human Rights with two main cases. The first case dealt with the exemption of Alevi children from the compulsory religious education, so that's Eylem Zengin against Turkey in 2007, while the second case dealt with the mention of religion on Turkish ID cards, which was compulsory until 2006, which is not anymore, but still you can't put Alevi in the case religion until now. So that was the case. And in both cases, the European Court stated in favor of the applicants. As I am a bit short of time, I shall develop only the first case. Well, it is about an Alevi citizen requesting to the local domestic authorities for his daughter to be exempted from lessons in religious culture and ethics. He claimed that under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, parents have the right to choose the type of education that children were to receive. He also alleged that the course was incompatible with the principle of secularism and was not neutral, as it was essentially based on the teaching of Sunni Islam. And so it was rejected, and he went to the Supreme Administrative Court, and all his requests were ultimately dismissed on the ground that the course in religious culture and ethics was in accordance with the Turkish legislation. So he resorted to the European Court of Human Rights, who found that the syllabus indeed gave greater priority to Islam than to other religions and philosophies. Besides, pupils received no teaching on the confessional or ritual specificities of the Alevi faith. So the court therefore found that religious culture and ethics lessons could not be considered to meet the criteria of objectivity and pluralism necessary for education in a democratic society. So interestingly, this decision was taken up by some Turkish authorities, domestic authorities, but not all of them. So the Council of State actually issued a ruling declaring that the religion courses could not be obligatory in their current form. And it took actually over the arguments of the European Court, so stating in the end that students should not be required to attend these courses. But the Diyanet criticized the Council of State, and until now, Turkish authorities did not change the curriculum. So we'll see if they do. So therefore, what we see is that Turkish authorities, and it is the same for ID cards, hardly implemented the European Court decisions until now. So actually, the judicialization of Alevist claims in Turkey through the European Court took the form of questioning the authoritarian imposition of one official religion from a freedom of religion point of view, and the form of legitimizing the principle of religious pluralism as a way to implement the neutrality of institutions. By way of a conclusion, let me just state that, in a way, this is a classical case of minority challenging the dominant religion. And this situation actually shows many parallels to those we have heard yesterday. So, but it is interesting still because it is a Muslim country which is where the European Court also has a say. So these questions again the consistency of the European Court decisions and the heterogeneity of the situations it has to deal with, questions that we raised already yesterday. One of the parallels I would like to raise is that here again we see that such disputes over the place of religion in the public sphere are channeled into the judiciary sphere. And the question is, what are the consequences of this process? And actually, in Turkey, we can see that the judiciary itself is very, very politicized. So there is a kind of blurring of the boundaries. I would like also to stress that the role of Europe in this whole process is double-edged, because one could expect that the support of European institutions for Alevi claims would expand the legitimacy of these claims. But on the contrary, the very fact that European institutions have supported these claims is widely considered in Turkey as dangerous and showing an illegitimate intrusion of foreigners supporting minorities against domestic authorities. And this leads to very strong resistance. Another point I would like to raise is that, again, those claims are not just about Alevis, but about the basic arrangements between state and religion. And in this framework, other groups also criticize the relationship between state and religion in Turkey. The most important of them being Islamists. And despite the fact that the Justice and Development Party, which, comes from an Islamist background, but is not really an Islamist party, however, has been trying to challenge this relationship between state and religion, it is not in the same direction. And in this very case, it has acted by really preserving the status quo. So that's where I will end today. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Soraya Tlatli. She's a local here at the UC Berkeley, and her topic is the separation of cult and state in colonial Algeria.
Thank you. This paper is an attempt to understand French secularism's relationship to Islam in the specific historical setting of colonial Algeria that I hope will help reveal some of the inner contradictions of French laïcité. Through this historical lens, I'm particularly interested in highlighting the functioning of the French secularism at two specific moments in time. Recently, the question of French laïcité has been at the core of the French national debate through the right-wing resurgence of the question of national identity, and more recently in its relation to the ban of the burqa from the public space. This ban has in turn given way to a discourse based on a series of mutual exclusion. On the one hand, various French intellectuals and politicians pondered on the antagonism between democracy and Islam, perceived as a theocracy unable to coexist with democratic principles. On the other hand, this ban has often been felt as part of a set of exclusionary repressive practices intended to singularize and marginalize Muslims in France. While it is certain that such exclusionary practices do exist, and as Valérie Amirault has brilliantly showed yesterday that such practices are based on racialization, it is also important to analyze historic processes of negotiations between the French body politic and in and out of France. What I would like to emphasize is less a set of exclusionary laws, such as the burqa ban, than the manner in which a set of rules regulating Islam in the public space were confronted in the everyday practice to a series of exceptions that put into question the status of laïcité, understood here according to one of its arch principles, that of the neutrality of the state. In order to do this, I will briefly consider the Commission de réflexion sur l'application du principe de laïcité, the Laicity Commission or the Stasi Commission, and the definition of laïcité this Commission proposes. I will then examine how the question of laïcité was understood and practiced in colonial Algeria. And in conclusion, I will discuss specific aspects of French laïcité as analyzed by Talal Assad in his essay, Trying to Understand French Secularism, published in Political Theologies. The Stasi Commission, or Laïcité Commission, composed of 20 members and chaired by Bernard Stasi, was established in July 2003 under the initiative of President Chirac. Its main official goal was to reflect on practical ways of applying laïcité to French civil society. Its main purpose was to find a solution to the problem of the headscarf. The creation of this commission was provoked by the debate surrounding the headscarf in public institutions and in school. The commission submitted its report on December 2003. Following the report in March of 2004, the French government approved a regulation forbidding the wearing of signs or clothes conspicuously denoting a religious affiliation. The main concept I wish to examine in this presentation, that of neutrality of the state, appears to be at the core of the Stasi Commission the Stasi report definition of French secularism. For the Stasi report, I quote, "In a laic society, any political intervention is illegitimate in the realm of spiritual orientations. The state neither imposes nor constrains. There is neither obligatory belief nor forbidden belief. Laicité implies the neutrality of the state. It should not privilege any spiritual or religious orientation." In 2004, 1 year after the Stasi report was made public, Bernard Stasi published an essay, Laïcité et République, in which he reasserted his credo. Laïcité, he wrote, supposes a mutual independence of political power and diverse spiritual and religious beliefs. The latter have no hold on the state, and in turn, the state has no power over them. When recounting the history of laïcité in France, the Stasi report evokes the status of laïcité in the colonies. And it seems to condemn this status quite strongly. I'm going to quote it in French and translate it then in English. Dans les colonies où la laïcité française rencontre l'islam, la politique de la République est marquée par l'ambiguïté. En Algérie, partie intégrante de la République jusqu'en 1962, la loi de 1905 prévoit la pleine application des principes de la laïcité. Mais, par le biais de décrets pris par le gouvernement d'Algérie, un régime d'exception est mis en œuvre avec un code de l'indigénat qui maintient le statut personnel musulman ou israélite. l'énonciation de principes républicains laïques et leur application sur un territoire donné sont révélateurs d'une contradiction propre à l'État colonial français. Ce processus interdit tout épanouissement de la théologie musulmane dans un environnement laïque. End of quote. So in English, it's my translation. In the colonies where French secularism encounters Islam, the politics of the Republic is fraught with ambiguity. In Algeria, an integral part of the Republic until 1962, the 905 law anticipates the full application of laic principles. However, through a series of decrees implemented by the Gouvernorat of Alger, a state of exception is put into place along with the indigenous code that maintain a Muslim or Jewish personal status. The enunciation of laic republican principles and their application in a given territory reveal a contradiction which is specific to the French colonial state. This process have prevented the blossoming of Muslim theology in a secular environment. End of quote. This quote is absolutely fascinating for me, mostly because despite the appearance of an open criticism of the colonial regime, it nonetheless maintains and perpetuates the same understanding of the relationship between Islam and the power in place that prevailed during in colonial Algeria. According to this passage, the passage I just quote, in the encounter between French secularism and Islam in Algeria, what seems to constitute the main obstacle is the implementation of the Code de l'Indigénat, the indigenous code implemented in 1865. According to the first article of this code, I quote, the Muslim indigene is French, however, he will continue to be subjected to Muslim law. He may be admitted to serve in the and Marine Army. He may be called to functions and civil employment in Algeria. He may, on his demand, be admitted to enjoy the rights of a French citizen. In this case, he is subjected to the political and civil laws in France. Now, to go back to the Stasi report and the passage I just quoted, it is interesting to note that it does not mention the Décret Crémieux, which in 1870 granted French nationality to Jews living in Algeria. Neither does it dwell on the discrimination between citizen and colonial subject that this code promoted by creating specific laws and penalties for the indigents in order to maintain le bon ordre colonial. The remarkable thing, however, about the Stasi report is that it completely distorts the historical situation, that of the understanding and practice of laïcité in colonial Algeria. Here, in the passage I just mentioned, it seems that the indigenous code is solely responsible for the exclusion of the Muslim subject from the public sphere. Ce processus, the indigenous code, interdit tout épanouissement de la théologie musulmane. If French laïcité defines religion as an individual expression, its core is the strict neutrality of the state in all religious matters. I would like to briefly examine how the very notion of laïcité founded upon, among many other things, but also upon the neutrality of the state, was both publicly affirmed and legally denied in colonial Algeria. The rapport Stasi implies that laïcité could not be applied in Algeria because of the religious orientation of the indigène, Islam, and because of the specific set of laws designed to control them, the infamous Code de l'Indigénat. In reality, the exact opposite phenomenon took place. French laïcité has never been practiced in colonial Algeria. It was, for obvious political reasons, put aside. French laïcité implies a freedom of choice, and thus it is based on the notion of an autonomous subject free to choose his or her religious orientation. Laïcité, therefore, contradicts the political status of the colonial subject, who by definition cannot be considered as an autonomous subject. Laïcité, then, in the sense of the neutrality of the state towards religious groups, has never been practiced in colonial Algeria. 2 years after the French law on the separation of church and state was passed, and it was passed in 1905, as you know. Another law was created in 1907, and it concerned exclusively colonial Algerias. One of the founding principles of the 905 law was that the Republic neither recognizes, nor salaries, nor subsidizes any religion. The 907 law deconstructed this founding principle. It went mostly ignored by French citizens living in France because it took effect outside of France. The irony of the 1907 law is that its spirit annihilated the principle of separation between state and church, the neutrality of the state, since it gave full power to the gouverneur général, the supreme power in Algeria, in any Islamic religious matters. The French colonial state had a final saying in choosing the right imam, approving or banning religious associations, giving agreement to religious meetings. The state controlled and funded all religious practices and rituals. The Muslims, agents du culte, agents of the cult, were de facto treated as French functionaries, subsidized and thoroughly controlled by the colonial administration. French laïcité, that is the neutrality of the state, was de facto banished from the French Empire. The irony of this situation is that it produced a specific type of discourse whose main goal was the justification of the profound divide between the laws of the Republic and their practical implementation in colonial Algeria. In this regard, this passage by Émile Larcher in his Traité élémentaire de législation algérienne from 1923 can be considered as exemplary. And I'm going to quote him both in French and English. Il est exact de dire que le principe de séparation est appliqué en Algérie comme en France. En règle générale, toutes dépenses relatives à l'exercice du culte ont disparu des budgets de l'Algérie, des départements et des communes depuis le 1er janvier 1908. And this is the tricky part. Mais cette règle ne va pas sans d'importantes exceptions, plus importantes que celles admises dans la métropole. So, it is accurate to say that the principle of separation is applied in Algeria like in France. As a general rule, each expenditure linked to cultural practices have disappeared from the Algerian budget since 1908. However, this rule does not go without important exceptions, more important exceptions than those allowed in metropolitan France. This quote perfectly illustrates perfectly the structure of power in colonized Algeria. It also illustrates the Schmithian notion of sovereignty. The power of the sovereign is precisely to create the exception. And it is precisely the institution of a perpetual state of exception that the Ulama Association sought to challenge in the most convincing way. The Ulama Association, founded in 1931 by Ben Badis, was an extremely powerful movement of pedagogy as well as of doctrinal reform, Islah. As James McDougall defines it in History and the Culture of Nationalism in Algeria, the Ulama Association aimed both, I quote, at the purification of Islam by a return of the supposedly uncorrupted fundamentals of the pious ancestors, and Islam's rational articulation in the modern Reformism was conceived by its protagonist as a sacred revolution, a revolution against ignorance. The influence of the association evolved greatly from the 1930s to the 1950s. First considered as a pedagogical and spiritual movement, it evolved and incorporated new ideological and political dimensions. It became not only a main competitor in terms of religious practices aimed at delegitimizing the cult of the saints, but it also put into question the very existence of the colonial system. Initially, the association claimed a very modest part and stressed its complete detachment from the public sphere. Quote, "We consider it as our duty to say that the association should only be an association meant to raise the Algerian people from its state of moral and intellectual dereliction. In any case, will it have any relationship to political life? However, this very attempt at raising the moral and religious awareness of the Algerian people became very quickly ideologically oriented. It became the vehicle for the affirmation of an autonomous Algerian identity. From 1931 to 1947, the Ulama Association vehemently opposed Algeria's specific religious status through fierce collective telegrams, articles, and a powerful essay published later in 1951, Mémoire sur la séparation du culte et de l'État, Association des Oulémas algériens. The association kept requesting and demanding from the French power to benefit from the same privileges the French citizens had, that is, a separation from church and state. They called it separation from cult and state. The French colonial administration rightfully perceived these demands as a major threat against its own power. In 1941, the ulama demands, the separation between cult and state, became an integral part of the French explicitly national movement directed by Farhat Abbas. Among one of his requests to the colonial power was neutralité dans l'interprétation du dogme musulman, the neutrality of the French state regarding the Muslim cult. In 1951, the Ulama Association published its Mémoire sur la séparation du culte et de l'État, written by Bashim Brahimi. It was broadly distributed in French and Arabic all over the territory. One of its major criticism was the following, quote, "One cannot explicate the reasons why the French government, being laic and laïcité forbidding any interference in religious matters, Islam is the only cult where the administration has to intervene. The 1905 law on the separation between cult and state Okay. The 1905 law of the separation between cult and state has been promulgated but has never been applied to Muslim faith. The Muslim people has never benefited from the separation implied by the Republican laws." The French administration was keenly aware of the threat that the Association des Oulémas, the Ulama Association, represented. In one of the telegrams sent to the gouverneur d'Alger, it summarizes the problem in those terms. En définitive, le problème du culte musulman se réduit à celui de nos rapports avec les ulama. Finally, the problem of the Muslim faith can be reduced to our relationship with the ulama. In conclusion, I want to stress that both discourses, that of the French colonial power and that of the ulama, are in fact mirroring each other. Neither party did believe in the separation between cult and state in Algeria. The ulama claimed this separation as an instrument of power, as a way of asserting a Muslim autonomous identity, and as a way of overpowering existing religious practices which they considered as obsolete. At the same time, however, the main stake became the political meaning of the laic neutrality. For the colonial power, it produced a double discourse. On the one hand, a republican discourse stressing the autonomy of any given religion, the freedom of choice. On the other hand, a discourse preoccupied to justify the many exceptions laïcité produced in practice. By not practicing French laïcité in the colonies, the French Republic could tighten even further its domination on colonized people by controlling every aspect of their life. This control was a stake in the ulama claim toward the strict application of laïcité in colonial Algeria. What is remarkable is that in both cases, the notion of neutrality is perceived as a main instrument of political power. I would like to suggest, in conclusion, that today, in contemporary France, the French government seemed to be engaged in a similar process despite a very different socio-historical context. Once again, the French state posits itself as a regulator of religion, showing in this process that the notion of religious neutrality is a myth that does not resist a political or historical analysis. According to Talal Assad's analysis, and I quote him, the Stasi report insists that secularism presupposes the independence of political power as well as of different religious and spiritual choices. However, what emerges from the report is that the relationship is not asymmetrical. It is claimed that the Republic treats all religions equally, but it does not preclude its taking certain decisions that affect religion, although religion may never intervene in matters of state. Laïcité is made up of exception, and it is the functions of sovereignty to identify and justify them. But in the view of the famous doctrine that France is la République une et indivisible, it is not entirely clear how the fear of disintegration relates to the singular invisible state as opposed to those many persons who represent it. End of quote. What I tried to suggest in my presentation was that despite a very different historical and political context, the same politics of exception is what comes to define the French laïcité in its relation to Islam in colonial Algeria and contemporary France. In both cases, the exception becomes the unsaid norm. In both cases, neutrality, one of the founding principles of laïcité, is nothing less than a political tool destined to assert a predominant power whose main function is to preserve the République une et indivisible.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow. All right. So we have one more, and this is also somebody who's right here locally, Professor Munir Jiwa, also responsible for, in part, organizing this conference. He directs the Center for Islamic Studies at the Graduate Theological Union, and his presentation will be, or is entitled, E Pluribus Umma, Secularism and the Mediation of Islamic Norms.
Thank you all again, and also to all the sponsors of this conference, again to Professor Olivier Roy. As many of you know, it's part of a longer series of conversations we've been having over the last 3 years at least, or 2 years at least. So I'm very grateful to have been part of this, and inshallah the conversations continue. And of course, a very warm thank you to Hedy and John and Sam and others who have put this conference together. I don't have a paper as such, but over the last 2 years, this title has changed a few times. We were initially sort of researchers in this project to look at different ways in which we might think about what was then called Islamic norms, and we've sort of expanded to religious norms. And I've gone through various iterations of my work. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I work on aesthetics and with Muslim artists. And I was always sort of at odds with how legal and legally prescriptive the norms that we were claiming to speak about were, and they didn't quite fit the communities that I was working with. Or the questions that were really sort of the thoughts and questions I had in terms of how norms are constituted or embodied or thought about amongst Muslims. So my first project, and this was a project of my dissertation many years ago, was really about how to displace the normative places where we find Muslims. So not all Muslims are at the mosque, and not all things Muslims do necessarily relate to Islam. So there are other kinds of norms or prescriptions or ideas that regulate our lives that are not always captured by the scholarship. So first and foremost, I was interested in just a more kind of academic, how do we come to know something? What are the kind of disciplinary ways in which we come to know? And so, again, as part of this project, there's been an emphasis, and I've learned a lot from those emphases on kind of legal and state, and the case studies we've heard, fascinating, but trying to learn from that and then applying them to my own discipline in anthropology and now theology, is how do these relate? Do these disciplines have anything to say to each other, or is one sort of at the level of kind of legalisms or legal theory and politics and the state, and is other one sort of at the level of practices? And so I was trying to find a way in which we could maybe think through these. Another kind of question is how and what we remember about events, and I'll go through some events to make this a little more clear. Other things that I've been preoccupied with is not just texts and the way in which we come to think about things, but images. You know, the mediation of globalized Islam through images is another front on which a lot of our conversations and our normative practices around Islam, whether it's the reformulation of religion or the reformatting, as Professor Roy calls, often these are just not mediated by images. The images themselves are embedded in this reformulation. So the relationship of images, text, context, and practices. The framing of Islam, which I've called, and forgive me for those of you who were at the Islamophobia conference a couple of weeks ago, I just presented on this work that I've been doing on the 5 media pillars of Islam. So we know the 5 pillars of Islam and what constitutes kind of a normative thinking about Islam through the 5 pillars, but these are the 5 media pillars, which I in fact call a secular norm. And they become so hegemonic and normative, these 5 frames, which I'll go through, that to think of Islam and Muslims outside of those norms becomes almost impossible. And to continue with that, this idea of metonymic freezing, to use Arjuna Padurai's term, or fixivity or classification. So not only do we categorize people in certain ways, but we fix them. So we can only begin to understand their lives in these very normative classifications. And again, to think outside of that, one gets classified as either apologetic or you haven't answered the question. And this will be clear as I share the examples. The next is just, my sense that religion itself was becoming a little too reified in our sort of commitments to understanding what is going on with religion. We were in fact somewhat reifying it. So related to the questions I was asking yesterday, I've been sort of thinking more about how to Americanize or Europeanize the problem rather than Islamicizing it, right? And so if we look at secular norms or secular fundamentalisms, we often we only think of religious norms as restrictive or oppressive. We often don't think about the fact that, we just embody and see as natural the secular norms in which we inhabit and live. But it's only religious norms that somehow become problematic, or the ones we question. We don't question the kind of the regulations at a secular level that we live by every day. The question I began with, where do we find Islam and Muslims, and what other norms do they live by? The work of global and local events to bring us into new conversations and social relations. So my initial project began with artists and thinking about not only where we locate Islam and Muslims, but the ways in which artists after 9/11 became a way in which we could imagine Muslim communities in new ways. And artists were often mobilized by the state in the US to be the kind of good Muslim, secular, Sufi, not really bent on faith itself. They're not really practicing. It was kind of Islam light. And it was palatable for the American, after 9/11. And it was a way of including Muslims who were safe. The artists are not the ones who are going to do terrible things to us or use Sharia to take over the country and all this kind of crazy stuff we're hearing now. But anyway, the artists were used in a way to think anew about who Muslim communities are. But artists were already categorized in these ways as being more secular or open, again, to fit a way in which Islam could be acceptable. So my own research has moved from how many of these artists sort of navigated the New York art scene after 9/11, and how the category Muslim became a way in which they imagined themselves. So prior to 9/11, these artists, and I worked with, not by design, but it happened to be all women artists that I ended up writing about, but they were categorized and classified by ethnic or other kinds of categories, art historical categories. So they were Bosnian or Malaysian or Nigerian or Pakistani or Iranian. After 9/11, they become Muslim artists. And it was both external to themselves, so the New York art scene, from MoMA to the Met to Museum of Natural History to art galleries all over New York, were taking this classification Muslim artist. I mean, what does this mean all of a sudden to call someone a Muslim artist? I mean, does it relate to an Islamic tradition? And what we were finding was that there was this shift back and forth. And most of these artists didn't use this category themselves. They began to use it because it was, whether it was convenient, because it allowed them more artistic opportunities, whether it made them think more about what it meant to be Muslim, because regardless of their theological commitments, they were being identified outside of themselves as Muslims. So that's how my project started. Then I moved from looking at how these artists navigate the New York art worlds to how artists actually navigate what it is, what their theological commitments look like. So it really displaced this idea that Muslim artists somehow are just Sufi-oriented or secular in nature. But here at the San Francisco Film Festival, we opened with the film New Muslim Cool a couple of years ago. And it's about a Puerto Rican revert, Jason Perez, Hamza Perez, as he goes by now. And looking at his life as a hip-hop artist. And it was fascinating because here is the San Francisco Film Festival. It's drawing a hip-hop artist and this film. And there was salat, there was prayer done right in the middle of the film festival, right? I mean, I think the associate director had said something like it's the first time she's ever seen prayer just kind of take off in this space. And then she was worried about why some people were praying and some weren't, and shouldn't the other people be praying? I mean, this is someone who's completely outside of the tradition, fascinated with what's going on with this space. And what was even more fascinating, I think, for people was they couldn't imagine that these artists and the communities in which they were drawing their audiences were religious, so to speak. Like they were praying and fasting, and these things were important to them. Because again, the idea is that if you're an artist and you're a Muslim, artistic creativity only comes from abandoning the ritual norms. Right? So you can only be creative insofar as you let go of some of the Islamic, quote-unquote, Islamic prohibitions on artwork, whether it's music or visual culture or whatever it is. And these artists actually explained themselves in the opposite way. They said, no, we're Muslim, we're practicing Muslims, we're committed to the faith, we cultivate those practices, and yet we're artists. So they didn't see this as a dichotomy. In fact, they explained the artistic world as one in which the norms of the art worlds were in fact restrictive. You have to have certain formal training, you have to present your artwork in a certain way. So that's the kind of backdrop of the work I've been doing, and I've been kind of working from Judith Butler's work on sort of how to understand frames and how we begin to understand ourselves through various categories and frames. So I'm just going to read this and then go quickly through my 5 media pillars. In her book, Frames of War, Judith Butler says, the epistemological capacity to apprehend a life is particularly dependent on that life being produced according to norms that qualify it as a life or indeed as part of life. In this way, the normative production of ontology thus produces the epistemological problem of apprehending a life, and this in turn gives rise to the ethical problem of what it is to acknowledge or indeed to guard against injury or violence. The frames that work to differentiate the lives we can apprehend from those we cannot, not only organize visual experience, but also generate specific ontologies of the subject. Subjects are constituted through norms which, in their reiteration, produce and shift the terms through which subjects are recognized. And I just want to move to my sort of media pillars, as I've been calling them, to sort of illuminate this otherwise very theoretical concept that Butler has shared with us. So these 5 media pillars, just in brief, are 9/11 has become an overarching frame in which to think about Muslims in the United States. Everything somehow relates to 9/11 as if Muslims have only arrived in the U.S. since 9/11. We know that they've been here right through its origins and through the Atlantic slave trade. The next is violence, terrorism, jihad, then veiling, Islam in the West, and the Middle East. These are at least 5 categories through which we've come to think about Islam and Muslims, and anything outside of that either doesn't fit, or as I'll show, there's very specific coded ways in which we come to understand these frames. The first one, 9/11 as an organizing frame, and it's part of an understanding of the work of events, and global events to put everything in public again, to pit ourselves one against the other, where we stand on certain issues. So we have the Danish cartoons as a global event, we have the Park 51 Islamic, we have so many examples of global events, and we all sort of, through these events, negotiate sides. We're called into taking sides almost, and there's very little room in the public to make these things complex. The public wants media sound bites. What we do is to try to complexify. So there's almost an odds with our disciplinary approaches in terms of what we are permitted to do. Baudrillard said in his Spirit of Terrorism right after 9/11, and I just want to read this very quickly. He says, when it comes to world events, we had seen a few, from the death of Diana to the World Cup, and violent, real events from wars right through to genocides. Yet when it comes to symbolic events on world scale, that is to say, not just events that gain worldwide coverage, but events that represent a setback for globalization itself, we had none. Throughout the stagnation of the 1990s, events were on strike. Well, the strike is over now. Events are not on strike anymore. With the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, we might even said to have before us the absolute event, the mother of all events, the pure event uniting within itself all events that have ever taken place. This goes far beyond hatred for dominant world power among the disinherited and exploited, among those who have ended up on the wrong side of the global order. Even those who share in the advantages of that order have this malicious desire in their hearts. Allergy to any definitive order, to any definitive power is, happily, universal, and the 2 towers of the World Trade Center were perfect embodiments in their very twinness of that definitive order. So it was kind of questioning of that symbolic power. 9/11 becomes the way in which we think about it. As we've seen with the example of the Park 51 Islamic Community Center, it was couched as an issue of sensitivity, a question of proximity, as if the so-called Ground Zero mosque is profaning the otherwise sacred ground of Ground Zero. And what's interesting about this is the liberal markers which we use to allow Muslims to inhabit a public space, right? So the mosque couldn't just be a mosque in and of itself. It couldn't have had a dome and minaret. Even in its most beautiful architecture, it had to only be a community center, right, for it to be legitimate. It had to be open to Jews and Christians. It had to have an interfaith center. It had to have a culinary school and a swimming pool and recreation center. It had to pay tribute to those who lost their lives on 9/11. Even then, it was never quite accepted as a community center. So imagine if it were a mosque in a traditional sense. Again, these essential features, these features are not essential to a mosque, but imagine if it was a dome and minaret kind of mosque right there, what kind of conversations it would be. The other thing is I gave a presentation where I started the Park 51, and this is what I meant by the very fixivity or scripted codes. If you began speaking about Park 51 and its architecture, or how it was supposed to be the greenest building, or the precise nature of what glass they would be using, or what the basketball courts were going to look like, or the utensils that were going to be used in the culinary school, people would think this is a major disconnect between those very localized conversations and the public understanding of Park 51. So this is the very disconnect I was referring to. Now, if I only focused on Park 51 as a building in which there would be a swimming pool, and I was going to talk about the kind of size of the swimming pool, people would think it's nuts. This is not what the public conversation about Park 51 is. It's about its proximity to Ground Zero, whether Sharia is going to take over. So again, those are the codes I'm talking about. So, and then those who talk about these issues in different ways are classified differently. So if I were to talk about Park 51's green architecture, I would be seen as apologetic, right? I would be seen as not really dealing with the issues, even though on the ground, much of my work with the community center has been at those very details of architectural and aesthetic practices. The next point is on violence. Violence, terrorism, fundamentalism. We can't speak about Islam and Muslims without, asking Muslims to denounce terrorism. Jihad, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, Madrasa are all English words now. Many actually know them only as English words. They don't know the Arabic or other languages that they come from. These are all English words. Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Philistine, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib. These are all the archives through which we begin to think about violence. The other note, and drawing heavily as I do on Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmoud, is that, as Talal Asad said in his on suicide bombing, it's interesting the way in which some versions of violence are acceptable to us. So when we violate or when we are violent as Americans towards others, it's palatable because we've already framed it as it's in their best interest, it's for larger democracy, it's for their freedom, and it will come. Yet when we're violated through violent means, it's always at a different register, right? They hate our freedoms, they hate this. So again, the idea of violence is constituted and couched in very different ways. When we perpetuate it, it's seen as legitimate. When it's done against us, it's a major violation. And yet, as I opened with, to apprehend a life means that we have to take these things both in the abstract and in terms of power, right? We are in some ways that both an economic and military power in the world. The next point is veiling, and I put Islamic patriarchy in quotes because, we often talk about Islamic patriarchy as if patriarchy is confined to Islam, right? We are often concerned about, women driving in Pakistan or Saudi and other places, but we don't care about the rapes that happen every 2 minutes in this country. So there's a major disconnect in which we understand these things. Veiling practices that are... I think we lost it for a sec. For example, there was just a report in BBC, and I was tracking the story a couple of years ago. Pakistan has now permitted the category of the third gender to be recognized on identity cards, right? So the third gender, can you imagine like this kind of a conversation in the US or elsewhere? And this is the Islamic State. So the ideas that we have about prescribing states to specificities based on the fact that they are Islamic or not tells us nothing about the ways in which people actually live their social lives. And of course, this also is about the focus on the headscarf, and we've heard a lot about it. The next category is Islam and the West. So again, the issues of compatibility, democracy, clash of civilizations, Sharia, and now the new one. If Muslims follow all the rules, we follow all the norms, the legal prescriptions. Now, if you can't get, Stop the Islamization of America project uses this new buzzword, and it's similar to the Stop the Islamization of Europe or the Eurabia project is taqiyya, right? So taqiyya means this kind of dissimulation of your faith when you need to. It's a very marginal concept in Islam itself, a specific Shia understanding of it, but now that's used. So ultimately, if Muslims follow all the rules, you really can't believe them because they can hide their faith. So that's the fourth category. The Middle East as the focus on the Arab world and on Israel-Palestine as the only way in which to come to imagine Islam and Muslims in the world today. And we all know that the majority of Muslims live outside of this region, namely in South Asia, Southeast Asia. So the idea that, and again, there's no problem with focusing on the Middle East, there's a lot to focus on, but the fixivity I was pointed to earlier is this. When I say Middle East or just talk about Middle East, people are not thinking flowing fountains and gardens and the magnificent architecture. They're thinking politics, they're thinking terrorism, they're thinking violence. So it's a very sort of a very specific way in which to understand these parts of the world. In the last 2 minutes, I just want to say that normally, I've been looking in my work for kind of the socio-political, historical circumstances in which we find Muslims and Islam, and again, looking to secular norms rather than looking at theological or religious explanations of why Muslims do X, right, or why they do Y, and fixing it to their faith. But what is happening in all of this external to Muslims is the reformatting, again to use Professor Olivier-Roy's terms, or the reformulating of religion itself, the theology and the theological practices. And I point to the 2005 and 2007 reports by the RAND Corporation here in the U.S. We are all probably very familiar with the RAND report. The first report pointed to something very interesting, which is it's not ultimately the terrorists who are a problem. You know, terrorists come and go. We can deal with them. The real problem we have is actually with the traditionalists. And by traditionalists, they mean those who actually take the Quran as the word of God, and those for whom the Sunnah is a legitimate everyday embodiment practice of everyday life. So these are the problem folks, the traditionalists. Well, then you have a huge number of Muslims who are going to be a problem. But the fact that they had differentiated that it's not the terrorists but the traditionalists, this is a major, I think, blow to the ways in which we come to think about religion in everyday life. A follow-up 2007, you would have thought they would have done their homework and maybe been a little more nuanced, and yet it got worse. The 2007 report makes these following recommendations, and then I'll close. It says that those dimensions, we need to work with Muslims who are of this ilk. Those dimensions include support for democracy, internationally recognized human rights, including gender equality and freedom of worship, respect for diversity, acceptance of non-sectarian sources of law, opposition to terrorism, and illegitimate forms of violence. So this was the road towards what they had called building moderate Muslim networks. And this was a State Department, this was recommendations made to the State Department to enact. Let's build moderate Muslim networks. And these networks included, and I'll just close with this, these are the 5 categories: to work with liberal and secular Muslim academic and intellectuals, to work with young, moderate religious scholars, to work with community activists, to work with women's groups engaged in gender equality and campaigns, and to work with moderate journalists and writers. So this idea of not just what's mediated outside of us, but the fact that there's a public policy attached to what look like free-floating images are detrimental to the ways in which we have not only misunderstood the multiple ways in which people live their religiosity or embody it or enact it and sense it, but the very rigid ways in which the state is involved with, again, being very precise about what constitutes religion, and in this case, what constitutes a good Muslim, right? So on that note, I will just end with saying I think part of our project here is to maybe push ourselves to thinking more in the terms of bringing together the legal and political, but more importantly, bringing together the very practices and embodiments of ways in which people who call themselves Muslims and other religious actors might actually be living their lives in all their complexity. So thank you very much.
Thank you to all 3 of the panelists. I think we can take a few questions.
So I'll try to be brief. It's just a few comments on Elise's presentation. Actually, the case of the Alevis in Turkey remind me of the case of the Ahmadis in Malaysia. So just very quickly, the Ahmadis in Malaysia are just 1,500 people, so it's quite marginal. And they're ethnically Malay, but do not practice the mainstream Islam promoted by the government, that is Sunni Shafi'i. So the Ahmadi faith is not banned in Malaysia, but they are still considered as deviant Muslim by religious authorities. At the same time, as you know, the Ahmadis are considered by the international Islamic authorities as non-Muslim, so this leads to a complete schizophrenic situation in Malaysia. So the question is like how Ahmadi can be seen as Muslim deviant in the first place if they're not Muslim. And then, well, again, it's we can talk about that later, but it's just because in Malaysia, religion is a marker of ethnicity, and in Malaysia, Malay must be a Sunni Shafi'i. And when you I would just finish with a short example related to religious education in Malaysia. So in public, which is government school, Ahmadis kids must attend religious classes, and so being taught the Sunni Shafi tradition. At the end of high school, they have to pass a religious exam, and one of the requirements of this exam is actually to list the Muslim deviant groups in Malaysia. And one of the expected answer is Ahmadis.
Yeah, I just have 3 very quick points. I was fascinated, once again, hearing your presentation on 5 media pillars. And what fascinated me recently is that they did not play out in the reporting of the Arab Spring. I mean, that took media in the United States off these 5 media pillar, which I think you've accurately identified. The second point is that women in the public sphere is itself a new phenomenon, relatively speaking. And that hasn't been made mention of. And thirdly, I was reflecting back on an article, a review article that I wrote in 2002, where there were many images of the United States engagement in Afghanistan, where the burqa in its Afghani meaning were repeated and repeated and repeated. And in that publication, so after 2001, I made reference to the deep, dark corners of media, in that references to Islamic fashion and any notice of body coverings was never mentioned.
Okay. Thank you, Sophie, for your comment. It's very similar, actually. And what is fascinating, I couldn't go into detail of this dimension for Alevis, but they are they don't agree about Alevinism being part of Islam or not, and actually also don't agree about Alevinism being chiefly a religion or a culture. And so this ends into differing strategies of claiming rights and reconstructing Alevinism in the public sphere. But what's interesting in this case is that the European institutions actually do define what is Alevinism, and both the German courts and the European court, actually not the European court directly, but at least the European Commission, they all define Alevinism as being a subgroup of Islam and as being a religious phenomenon, which actually not all Alevis do claim, and they are, I'm not sure they are aware of the very strong meaning of what they say, because it's just a very big debate. So that's very interesting in this respect. Oh, yes, Munir.
Yeah, I will get to Carol's question as well, but Sophie, thank you. You know, it reminded me a little bit of you know, to make a parallel, and it's not so equal, but the test that the Dutch presented to, like you were talking about the test at the end, which one is, right? The Dutch presented a test to Muslim immigrants about how liberal or tolerant they will be of certain kinds of secular norms, and they showed images of gay people and asking Muslims what they thought, and interview tests for immigration to see where they stood on their comfort level. And you had to say, of course, if you said, I'm not comfortable with this, well, you know, and if you say you're comfortable with it, then you're a good Muslim, good immigrant, welcome. You know, so it's a kind of interesting, it's a kind of play on that. You know, these kinds of tests to discipline people really are very interesting sites to look at the precise way in which people are forced to make certain kinds of choices. And it doesn't enunciate anything in some ways. Okay, you can say it, you mark the right thing because you need entry, or you don't want to be jailed, or you don't want to be killed. You know, you make that, but what does it actually say in terms of people's embodiment? So I just wanted to throw that out there. I thought there's some parallel there. In terms of the Arab Spring, Carol, thank you for that question. You know, they didn't play out in the same way, but you know, in terms of policy, there was a lot there, because these pillars were at play insofar as there was questions about how is it? I mean, people were perplexed that the revolution could be so nonviolent. The only acceptability, the only register at which we were able to think about this was its nonviolent nature, forgetting that violence and nonviolence works together, and this nonviolent nature was not always nonviolent, and it comes at a culmination of something. So I think as an event, it's very interesting to think about how secularism, religion comes together, violence, nonviolence, Christians, Copts, Muslims, atheists, they all come together in this event, and without a kind of shared, necessarily a shared idea of where they're going with it. It's Hannah Arendt's thoughts about they come together at a moment, not necessarily with a shared past and not any event of the future. I think that in of itself is fascinating. The other thing is that there were questions. They were like, people were a bit surprised to see the prayer in the middle of the revolution, and then the Christians holding hands around to protect him. I mean, these were images that were used to say, well, let's see how this plays out. But I think they were at work, not necessarily in this mediated way, but they were work at how it's trained us to think about a revolution. What we expect from a revolution and what we expect others to do, right? The only reason it was palatable was because it was nonviolent. And yet, we're amongst the most violent people in the world in the US, and to expect that kind of thing I think it's phenomenal. Again, and also the idea of women in the public sphere, it's still tied to the fact that they couldn't believe that veiled women could be side by side with people who were not veiled, and people were praying and not praying. So I think it brought a lot. I mean, this event, I think, has brought a lot of these things together. What is secular? What is religious? What is Christian and Copt and atheist? And all of these, I think, were blurred in that sense. And I'm not sure of your reference to the last one. So I'd love to learn more about what you mentioned in terms of the bodily coverings. Thanks.